Pleasure to see you all. Pleasure that we can be here and we can be together. In just a moment, I actually want to start out my thoughts with some audience participation. And as you can see, we're talking about this idea of holiness. A full disclosure, I was going down a completely different track of thoughts for a sermon earlier in the week. And the more that I got to studying, the more that I went and really started looking at this idea of holiness. And I started using one of the website, the Bible Project. So I would highly encourage you to go there. There's a lot more information about even what we're going to talk about today there. But I want you to think about for a moment, what or how would you define holy? All right, so this is where I want some audience participation. What would you say is the definition of holy? Sanctified, okay, a lot of times we say sanctified or separate, set apart. Pure, okay, yeah, what else? Special, somebody else said something in the back. Godly, yeah, okay. So we even say the idea of moral behavior. You know, we think of this idea of I'm living on a different level, but yet at the same time, that has a negative connotation to it. Because you say, oh, well, you're just holier than thou, aren't you? Or we may say it is the idea of the absence of some impurity, right? But let's be real. When we define it in all of these terms, does that really help you in your daily life? Does holy seem real to you? In some ways, I would say, as one person put it, he said, that word still feels sort of stuffy, doesn't it? I mean, let's be honest. If you went and you said, hey, I'm going to be holy today, what would everybody else say? Who are you? You know what I'm saying? So how is it that we can make holy seem real to us? That's what I want us to do today, and I'm not going to be able to get through all of it today. We're going to continue on even next week. But what I want you to do is I want you to begin by thinking of a time, hopefully in your life, where you had a transcendent moment. What that means is where it's more than just a mere physical human experience. A lot of times we may think of that in terms of when we're out in nature, when we look at this beautiful mountain, or we look up at the sky at night and we see the stars and we start to fathom how far away they are, and yet we see their light. I want you to even maybe fathom the idea of the ocean. Think for a moment about the ocean. Think about its consistency. You realize whether you're at the shoreline right now or not, the waves just keep coming in. Think about its longevity. The ocean has been there before you and me, and I would probably say it's going to be there after you and me. Think about its abundance. It is over the entire planet. What is it? 3/4 of the planet is water. Think about its uniqueness. To my knowledge, there is no other planet that has ocean. Think about its power. You could be on the shoreline building a sandcastle. What's going to happen? In comes the waves and it's gone. We can say, oh, no. We're going to build a house on the shore. What happens? Hurricane comes in. There it goes. The power of this entity, if you will. There's a sense in which we get this awe from it. When we see something that is bigger than ourselves, That's where that awe comes into play. When we begin to think of our smallness in terms of the ocean, of our mortality, and our lack of power. That's where I want us to begin this morning as we think about this and try to unpack this term, holy. I want these thoughts to sort of frame our mind as we begin to think about that. And I want us to just sort of start where we find the very first use of the word holy, and that is at the burning bush with Moses. If you'll recall, Moses is a fugitive from Egypt. He's killed somebody there, and so he's gone on the run. And now he has been a shepherd for some 40 years out in the wilderness of Midian. He's about 80 years old now. And he comes upon this bush that is burning, but it doesn't burn up. So let's read what the account tells us. In Exodus 3, verse 1 beginning, it says, "Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I'll turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. Then the Lord saw that he turned aside to see. God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. He said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. When Moses first sees this bush, what's his reaction? It's surprise. It's curiosity. He says, I'm going to go over here and see something because there's something that is above the natural. When we see fire, when we see a bush on fire, we expect it to be consumed, especially if it's dry. It's going to be consumed very quickly. That's not the case. And so Moses says, I'm going to go over here and see it. And as he approaches, the intensity increases. And God calls out to him. Just put yourself in Moses' shoes. What do you say when God calls out to you? Here I am, right? That's what Moses says. He says, Here I am, God. The divine presence was in this bush. God stops him from coming any closer, and he tells him, you need to take off your shoes. Now, what's Moses' reaction? It's terror. He hides his face because he recognizes he shouldn't be here. I have no right to be in this place. You see, the space around God radiates His holiness. His presence is so powerful, so unique, that it makes the surrounding area unique and set apart. But now let's think about this. Why did God tell Moses to stop? I mean, there's a certain point where God wants him to come up to it, right? He says, I'm going to turn aside and I'm going to go to this bush. But then there's a point at which God says, don't come any closer. Why is that? I think it's because he would die if he came any closer to the divine being. That is the all-powerful, the all-beautiful, the all-good God, because Moses is not that. You see, God's holiness is a way of talking about God's character and His nature. as the most unique, as the most powerful, the most beautiful, the most good being in the universe. Think about it like this. If you think about the sun, our sun in our solar system, it radiates heat and power. We call it solar power, right? But what happens if you get too close to the sun? You die. Because we can't handle its essence, if you will. Well, there is this paradox of God's nature here. That God's presence is dangerous to Moses because he in some way is impure. It's not that God's power is bad, but it's because God himself and his power is so good that Moses himself can't handle that. Well, how do you enter space that is holy? God tells us. He says, remove your shoes. I want you to think about that for a moment. There is a normal way of living that Moses was living. But Moses had to change that to come into close proximity with God. I want you to consider for just a moment. Think about where Moses' shoes had been. Where's Moses? What is Moses? He's a shepherd, right? What do shepherds do? They're around sheep all day long. They don't shepherd from afar, right? They're up close with sheep. Well, what do sheep do? Well, there's going to be sheep urine. There's going to be sheep poop all around. That was the normal way of living for Moses. For 40 years it had been that way. I imagine he probably had some sheep poop on his shoes. And God is telling him, take off those shoes. I mean, we all understand that, right? How many of you, raise your hand, how many of you would lick your shoes? None of you, right? Why? Because we understand something about that. We understand there's things that are down there on the bottom of my shoe that I don't want in my mouth. Right? It is the idea that something natural and even common is dishonoring in the presence of such beauty, power, and grandeur. It actually happened to me this week. I was all into studying about the holiness of God. And then out of nowhere on my phone pops up one of my apps that says, what was your football moment that changed your life? And I'm like, what? It was incongruous. It didn't fit with the moment that I was in. Or maybe this way. Think about it. You're standing at the edge of the ocean. You're just looking at its grandeur, its beauty, and its power. And then somebody comes up and says, hey, look at my funny cat video. We understand those two things don't go together. And that's what we see here with Moses, is that Moses' normal way of living did not fit with God and being in his presence. So let me ask you this. Is it good to be in God's presence? I mean, if I could die in God's presence, is it good to be in his presence? Okay, everybody, the answer is yes, okay? Shake your heads, yes. It is good to be in his presence because when we come into his presence, what we understand is there is something so good. There is this power that is beyond me. There is this abundance. There is this fullness that I don't have right now because of where I'm living. And I want that. I want total satisfaction. I want all that is God. And so we want to be in His presence. But to do so means that we have to change to come into the holy. I would say it this way, there are certain protocols that we have to go through to come into the divine presence. Again, go back to the ocean. Think about its consistency, its longevity, its power, its abundance, its uniqueness. There's a sense in which we could say that the ocean is holy, in that it is set apart. There's nothing else like it. But think about this. You can't just go into the ocean. How many of us want to be right there in the midst of the ocean? None of us. We recognize the essence of the ocean is going to overwhelm me. So there's protocol that we have to go into the ocean. One, you probably need a boat. Two, if you want to go into the ocean, you probably need scuba gear. And even that is only going to be for a certain amount of time, because we cannot handle the essence of the ocean. It's not that the ocean's bad. It's just that we can't handle that as we are. So there's protocols. When we talk about God's holy presence, we see that same idea. If we continue on with the story with Moses, he brings the children of Israel out of Egypt, out of their slavery, and he brings them to the same place. He brings them to Horeb. He brings them to Sinai. And God descends on the mountain. His holy presence comes down, and all the people are afraid of it, as any of us would be. But God comes there and he says, I want to make a covenant with you. And I want to put my presence in the very middle of your nation. And so what we see is things now that are associated with God become holy. They become set apart. They become unique for God's purpose. So we see things like holy days. Holy clothing, the priest's clothing was holy. Holy water, holy people, and holy places. And what we find is that in the very tabernacle, and then even further we see the temple, becomes this place where heaven and earth intersect. It becomes this place where man comes in contact with God's presence. And that becomes a holy place. Here's a diagram of the tabernacle. It had an outer court, but then it had the place where you would go into the tabernacle, the holy place. But then there is the Holy of Holies. That is the place where God's glory, the physical display of God's glory, the glory cloud, would rest in that Holy of Holies. Here's just a depiction you can sort of see side by side. Cutaways of the tabernacle and the temple. Both of them were covered with gold. Solomon goes on and he builds the temple. He builds then very much this same idea. There's the holy place, but then there's the Holy of Holies in the temple. It is constructed, it is a perfect cube, 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet. It is covered with gold all around it. And in it are the cherubim that have these 15-foot wingspans. That one wing touches the edge of one wall, then the other wing touches the other cherubim's wing, and so forth, and they get to the other side. And engraved all around it are palm trees and fruit. It's a depiction of Eden. But that's a sermon for another time. But what I want you to grasp here is this idea that here is this holy place, the Holy of Holies, but only one man can go into it one time a year, the high priest. He's the only one. God's in the presence. He's in the midst of Israel, but only one man can go into the Holy of Holies, and he is fearful when he does so, because he is going in to make atonement for the sins of the people. But here's the point. God wants people to share in His holiness. He wants them to share the qualities of beauty, goodness, power, and truth. That's who He is. That's His essence. But if one is to come into the presence of the divine, that means there are certain ways of living that are inappropriate. And so what we see is that Israel took off their shoes, if you will, figuratively. Leviticus 11, verses 44 and 45, it says, "For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground, for I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." Notice what God is doing here. He's giving them the protocols for being in His presence. He says, this is what it's about. It is about this purity. And so we see this purity then take form, and we see this contrast between the holy and profane, between sacred and common, between pure, clean, and impure and unclean. And what God is trying to describe is these are the protocols that you need to do to come into my presence. And so we see ritual purity. That where God is basically saying, I don't want you to have anything, I don't want you to touch anything associated with being dead. So dead bodies. If you have a disease on your skin, you can't come into God's presence. The idea of mold or certain bodily fluids, all of these things are sort of represent for Israel that idea of death. And it's the idea that something that is impure, when I touch it, then I become impure. For example, what happens if you step in a big old pile of manure? Do you just step back out and go, hey, I didn't get anything on me? No. You step in it and it gets all over your shoe. It means that your shoe sort of becomes impure. That's this idea of this ritual impurity. And it's not necessarily that they couldn't be unclean. There were times where they were unclean. The problem came is if they were unclean and then they came into God's presence. That was the problem. But if we go further, we see there was social purity. The idea of, well, what are the kind of relationships that you should have with people? What kind of righteousness should you have in relation to marriage and neighbors and foreigners who are around you? All of those types of things, we see that. And then we also see this inner purity of the moral mind. And really what God does is He displays all of that for us in His Word. He shows us this is what holiness means. And so we see that if you think about the law that was given, it was very much focused on the ritual purity. The prophets, in many ways, had this idea of the social purity of, what are you doing? You're forgetting the orphans and the widows. How are you treating people who are around you? And you think about the wisdom literature, very much the idea of the inner purity. How shall I live? The kind of thoughts that I am to have. You see, Israel had to change to be in the divine presence. Now let me ask you this. How'd it go? Israel failed miserably. Throughout their history, we see they couldn't do it. And so for just a few moments now, I want you to think about God's plan for holiness. We're going to do that with looking at Isaiah's vision in Isaiah chapter 6. In Isaiah chapter 6, it says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. Now, let's get the picture right. Where is Isaiah in this vision? He's there in the Holy of Holies. This is just an artist's rendition of the Holy of Holies. But Isaiah's vision, he's there. He is in a place where he has no right to be. He's not the high priest. He should not be there. But he's there. And it's as if this whole holy place is coming alive, if you will. These seraphim are on either side of the divine presence. These seraphim who are symbols of the created realm of life, they are sort of anchoring, or they are on both sides of the author of life. And they call out, holy, holy, holy. That's the only time in the Old Testament where that word holy is used 3 times in a row. And they are connecting that with God as the Creator. Because the literal meaning of that there is, the fullness of the whole earth is His glory. Isaiah is witnessing, he is in the presence of the utterly unique one, God Almighty. I want you to think for just a moment. What is Isaiah's reaction? If we go on, we see in verse 5. And Isaiah is saying this. He says, Woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with the tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. What is Isaiah's reaction to this vision? He's in terror. Just like Moses at the burning bush. He's fearful. He says, I shouldn't be here. Why? Because he recognizes his inadequacy in the presence of God Almighty. When he sees, here is the author of love, who is love, of purity, of righteousness, of truth, of power, of justice, on and on and on. When he sees all of that, his reaction is to say, Woe is me. I want you to think about that for a moment. Isaiah is overwhelmed. Because I think it's the idea is, when you see the pureness of God, and that's hard for us to even comprehend, but Isaiah got to witness this in a vision. When you see the pureness of God, And then you reflect on all that we think is important. How many likes we get on Facebook or Instagram. How much I need to hold on to this grudge because I am unwilling to forgive this other person. How much I love things that I'm grappling for because I think they're going to satisfy me. When we begin to start thinking about all the things that we think are important, in light of God's purity, His divineness, His holiness, it magnifies how bad we are in light of His goodness. You see, all of our moral compromises are exposed in God's presence. And I really think that in this vision, Isaiah, when he understands what is going on, when he looks at himself, I think he is saying, I'm about to be destroyed. I mean, just put yourself in Isaiah's shoes. He's witnessing all of this grandeur. He's hearing these beings that when they speak, everything quakes. And then what does he witness? One of these beings grabs a coal from the altar of incense that is there in the temple, and he starts coming towards him. What would you do? I'd be crazy. I'm about to die right now. This is going to happen. This is it. But he touches, the seraphim touches his mouth. And he says, behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Isaiah doesn't die. You see, normally we think, okay, impure things, if I touch them, they get impurity on me. But now we see just the opposite. That God's purity transfers to Isaiah, making him pure. You see, God's purity goes out. Isaiah owns up to his own brokenness. He doesn't say, oh, well, it's my people, God, it's not me. No, he says, I am broken. I am a man of unclean lips. And now God's holiness, that which we thought was dangerous to us, because if we got too close to it, it would kill us. When that holiness comes in to us, it invades our space, if you will. It invades Isaiah's space. And it makes him more like the Holy One. You see, for his sin to be dealt with, Isaiah had to be transformed by God's holiness. And here's the one takeaway that I want you to see this morning. So many times we think we must shape up to be with God in His space. The vision of Isaiah says just the opposite. That instead, God comes into our space to make us like Him. He comes into our space to restore us, to redeem us, to make us what we were meant to be. His image bearers. I don't know about you, but when I studied that this week, I was like, wow! That's mind-blowing for me. Because I'll be honest, so much of the time, I'm striving, I'm saying, oh, Lord, I got to be holy. And God's whole point is, no, you can't do it. I will do it for you. So I want to leave you with this morning. I want to ask you, what is your view of God? Two options. One, do you see God as waiting for you to shape up so that you can be with Him? Or two, do you see that before you ever existed, He made a decision to come into your space so that He could bring you to Him? Those are two totally different views that will completely shape how you live your life. And I think a lot of times we're torn between those two views. So this morning I ask you, what do you know and what do you understand of God's holiness? I hope this morning that it's a little bit less stuffy. And maybe it's a little bit more real for what He has done for you. That's His invitation to each and every one of us. He says, I want you to be in my presence. If that is not the case in your life this morning, He is calling out to you. We'd certainly love to pray for you. We'd certainly love if you want to become His child in the grave of baptism. His offer is open for you. Won't you come?